you, Jakob. And a warm welcome to all of you from me. I'm Sune Haugbølle, and I'm the associate professor at Roskilde University and leads this group called Secular Ideology in the Middle East. And actually, all of us are represented here today, some at the table, and Andreas Bandag also in the back. And I'm also a fellow at CRIC, an associate fellow. And I think the merging of the issues of conflict resolution and the issues that we are interested in at Roskilde University, namely revolutions going on in the Arab world and the issue of secularism, are merging quite nicely in this conference. I want to start by saying a few words on what it means to compare Lebanon and Syria. And Jakob already said some clever things on the limits, but also the promises of making that comparison in the next 2 days. Last year, I wrote a couple of articles where I suggested that we are in 1977. 2013 resembles 1977. The stage of the conflict in Lebanon, where two easily definable sides, the right and the left, as it was in Lebanon, was giving way to a gradual fragmentation of the scene and giving way to a much longer phase after 1977, which, as you all know, lasted all the way to 1919, which was characterized by militia consolidation, first of all, the retreat of ideology in the movements, and an increasing fragmentation of geography and society. Many of the original instigators, or revolutionaries, if you want to call them that, in the Lebanese national movement were sidelined after 77, and especially after the death of Kemal Jumblat. That's often where you sort of mark the end of that phase of the war. Sometimes people say the so-called 2-year war ended in 1976 with the entry of the Syrians, but I think the death of Kemal Jumblat is a more significant point in time to say that this was the first phase of the war, and then came the much longer second one. Perhaps we could say that what was known in the beginning of the Syrian revolution as the opposition showed signs of fragmentation in 2013. The main institutions of the Syrian National Council Coalition later and the Free Syrian Army have shown signs of fragmentation. Of course, they're still with us, but we are left with a less clearly defined typology of key actors and drivers of the conflict. And this is not to say that there isn't a basic conflict in Syria, that it isn't about something. But even if we support and believe in the revolution, we have to admit that the picture is a lot more muddled now than it was in 2011. And the same could be said about Lebanon in 1977. And that was just a speculative comparison that I was making in those articles. It was not meant to really be a bulletproof comparison. There's a lot of differences, and Jakob pointed some of them out. But it was a way to say that if we are in 1977, we could potentially have 13 years of conflict ahead of us. That the war entered a particular phase with characteristica that meant that it was locked in for 13 more years. This is not what we want. So it was a way to say we do need conflict resolution, we do need steps towards ending this conflict now, otherwise it might enter a phase that shows some similarities with this very long and tragic phase of the Lebanese Civil War. And of course there was another dimension to the comparison, which is the obvious one, the internationalization of the conflicts of the war in Lebanon. And the same thing could be said about Syria. The internationalization in Lebanon began with the Syrian invasion in 76, and of course with the Israeli invasion in 78, first invasion. But the internationalization wasn't restricted to interventions of armies. It was about the support of outsiders for militias and the way in which that sustained the militia system, the war system. That wasn't something that happened just at once. It was a gradual process. And I think internationalization of the conflict in Syria has been with us from the beginning, because there have been so many key issues at stake for outsiders. You know, the players we know: Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, Iraq, Turkey, to some extent France, the US, and so on. Third-party intervention is a general pattern of civil conflicts, and of the Arab uprisings too, where proxy wars the fact that other conflicts, other issues are played out in a war setting tend to prolong fighting, and that raises the stake gradually for the involved parties, who must then all be brought to the table. Not just the parties inside the country, but all the outside parties should be brought to the table before conflict resolution can be found. Or one side must defeat the other, which is another way of conflict resolution. Or a very strong hegemonic third party must emerge, which emerged in the case of Syria in '89 and the CRIC report that followed. So just to say again, this is just a speculative metaphor, and I think Lebanon from 1975 to 1990 is a speculative metaphor for what's going on in Syria today. But nevertheless, it is one that's been coming back to me over the last 3 years, time and again. And I think to some of us in the room, which is why we're here, and it's time to dig a little bit deeper and hopefully arrive at some conclusions about the usefulness of, first of all, the rich and varied literature that we have on the Lebanese civil war. It's a very well documented, but also very well studied conflict. And we should use some of that experience to think creatively about, first of all, how this war could be ended, but also how we can understand it, of course. Because in Syria we also have a very well documented conflict, but it's not very well researched so far. And we have a certain bewilderment in terms of ending the conflict, of course, or even appeasement measures, which is also why we're here. So for my paper, the question that I've been thinking about is the issue of mobilization. Why and how people get mobilized for fighting, but also how they get mobilized for the opposite, for peace and civil society activities. And in a way that merges my previous work, my older work on the Lebanese Civil War and on memory of the war, and the work we're doing at Sune today on the left and on activism in and around the revolutions. So I want to ask today in this paper which forms of representation and mobilization that emerged in the Lebanese Civil War, and what that can tell us perhaps, potentially, about the forms of mobilization that we see in Syria today. And I'm not so much after political opportunity structures or relative deprivation, the key words of social movement theory, because I think we know a lot about that in the Lebanese case. We know why the war started. We know a lot about the Palestinian issue, regional questions, the quota system, what people disagreed on, the social justice issue, and why the war started. What I'm after is the dynamic development in the war of these issues, the dynamic development of mobilization in a very dynamic setting, which the war became, and which the war in Syria is too. So I'm saying that the issues change and the forms of mobilization and representation change during the conflict, and we should look at this as mobilization and representation. And let me just say a few words about this terminology. And for representation, I rely on the classic work of a political scientist called Anthony Birch. He says that in politics, representation or representative is an agent or a spokesman acting on behalf of his principal constituency, a person sharing some characteristics of a group of persons, or persons symbolizing the identity of a class or a group of persons. And that kind of representation is crucial for political culture, because it defines the mechanisms of conferring authority to individuals who will usually be elites. This is what I mean by representation. These mechanisms are, of course, inscribed in political norms, in constitutions, and so on, in texts, but also in cultural forms such as charismatic representation, where individuals become symbols for larger groups in society. And you see an example here of what that looks like in this setting. The primary group of representative elites in Lebanon after 1943, to this day, and even before 1943 actually, are the Sulama, powerful politicians who represent their constituencies in parliament. They act as spokesmen and symbols for their groups. And what happens, and this is a very brief sort of overview of the arguments I want to go into more details with, what happened from the 60s onwards is that social movements started to play an increasingly powerful role in politics in Lebanon. And these movements, many of them were formed around charismatic individuals and they had an ideological phase, so there was an entry of ideology in mass politics around that time, and that destabilized the system of Suama rule. Michael Johnson has written very insightfully about that, amongst others. But what happened also was the entry of sectarian leaders and sectarian mass movements with similar characteristics of charismatic leadership. And they, of course, became crucial and important in the war. People like Musa Sabah. They copied certain elements of the new secular leaders' ideological. So in this period before the war, ideology made its appearance as a strong political force. And in my book, War, Memory in Lebanon, I traced this challenge to the old system in the war and to representation. And basically I conclude that it collapsed and was replaced by a new system during the war, which was that of the militias. So you had what George Porter talks about as the war system. And we'll go into details on what that means. Non-elites, who had been largely excluded from the public sphere, came to the fore because of the war. And what happened was that the system of elite representation was restored and partly reinstalled with the type of force of 89, but only as a result of a compromise that accommodated both the old and the new orders. And I think some of the new leaders that we saw after the Civil War symbolized that. They were upcomers, they were upstarts. And they found a way to work with the old new system, so to speak. So we could sum this change up from the 60s to the 90s as a conservative order that was challenged by revolutionary forces, then broke down, or partly broke down, but it re-established itself, albeit in an altered form, in a changed form. Mobilization made new forms of representation possible in Lebanon. And I'm talking about the mobilization in the war. It changed the political system in this way. And I think the same dynamic process is unfolding in Syria today. Conflict is changing a set system of representation, and very dramatically, of course, very drastically. And this is the difference that Jakob was alluding to. In Syria, we have a very strong state, a very brutal state, and the issues at stake were different. The system that the revolution in Lebanon was trying to change was a very different kind of system, to say the least. So let me just continue with this speculative comparison by going more into detail with the Lebanese case first, and then return to Syria afterwards. I had a few things to say about social movement theory, but I think we'll leave that for the questions if any of you are interested in how social movement theory is challenged by some of this stuff on mobilization. We can come back to that. The basic point is that a lot of social movement theory to today has not really allowed for the dynamic changes that happen within a conflict, but look more at the root causes before the outset of a conflict. And I think it's necessary to look at how informal networks are not only in place before conflict, but also how they change drastically. And this is what a lot of people are doing now on the Arab uprisings. A lot of the informative work in political anthropology, ethnographically informed work on the Middle East is going in that direction. So when we look at the Lebanese civil war, it started as a very ideological conflict. And later, economic opportunity became a self-perpetuating incentive for the militias and everyone involved with this war system to prolong the war. An incentive to prolong the war became a logic of its own. And as such, and this is a citation from David Keane, one of the people who've been key in the debate around greed and grievance in the last couple of decades. So he's saying that I would say that it resembles many other civil wars of the late 20th century, which started with the aim of taking over the reins of the state or breaking away in a successionist revolt, and appear to have subsequently mutated, often very quickly, into wars where immediate agendas, could be economic agendas, may significantly prolong themselves. I mean, the key insight here is that the people who become the war system have no interest in ending it. When the war broke out in April 1975, the relationship between Christian and Muslim Suama had already been tested by the clashes between the Lebanese army and Palestinian militias. During the first phase of the war, what we call the 2-year war, up to the autumn of '76. The social and political consensus on which post-independence Lebanon had been built effectively disintegrated. Some Suama, like Kamil Shabaoun, Kamal Jablat, and Sulaiman Faranji, converted themselves into militia leaders, while some of them even kept a position as political leaders in the government still at the same time. While other pillars of the old system, including Sunni and Shia notables from Beirut, Tripoli and Sidon, attempted to keep their distance from the increasingly sectarian conflicts, and this soon proved very difficult, even impossible. The pace of the wars took the old apparatus by surprise. Daily retribution, intimidation, petty violence, passport murders, all the stuff we know, induced many people to rally behind the party of their village, their high, their neighborhood, their sect, and so on. Leaders who failed to realize these changes, imposed by the circumstances of civil war, quickly lost the control of their clientele. For years, urban Sunni leaders had tried to appease the pan-Arab tendencies that appeared, and again, this is a drawing on Michael Johnson's work, that appeared in their constituency in the 50s and 60s, while they also tried to keep good relations with the other Suama, their colleagues on the Maronite side, at least. During the clashes of 75 and 76, they lost the allegiance of their street. Some groups remained under the control of the Suama, but in other cases, the lieutenants, what we call the kabadayat, the strongmen, rebelled and took charge of representing the localities in question, the neighborhoods in particular. With the powers of their patrons receding, they now expressed themselves in organized neighborhood gangs, which began to control the street, often supported actually by money from the outside, from Libya, from Iraq, and from God knows where, which bypassed the Suama and empowered the new leaders directly. This is how the Kabadayat became the new voices of the street, at least in West Beirut. And perhaps there are some elements of similarities here to the FSA and to the brigades in the FSA. Of course, the difference being that it is a national institution, but as we know, composed of different brigades. I'm thinking of the relations with the local level and their level of representation of their locality and how important it is for their ability to fight. I think this is one of the things we can discuss. If we look at East Beirut, there were military structures in place already to organize and direct the street. We had Shamaoun's National Liberal Party. It had long represented what was seen as the Christian ethos of many well-established Beiruti families, whereas Al-Kataib appealed to the newcomers, many of the Maronites coming from the mountains, but certainly not to the large Greek Orthodox bourgeoisie, who regarded Kataib as very boorish. Later in the war, this boorish party, of course, the Kataib and later the Lebanese forces came to dominate the total representation of the Lebanese forces under Bashir Jumail. This is what's called the unification of the Christian gun. Although Bashir and other high-ranking phalangists were from well-established families, many were not, and the development as a whole in the Christian sects could be described as a passing of power from an old guard to, many of them were actually killed, to a new, more centralized and more radical organization, which was the Lebanese forces. And I think there's obviously a big difference here between those developments and the Free Syrian Army. Again, the Free Syrian Army is a national organization of different brigades with somewhat different agendas, but still the same goal and an attempt to organize them, of course. So there's, again, a limit to the comparisons here. The early part of the war, if we look at that, was popular and spontaneous. There were really elements of fighting to support and protect individual communities. But there was also a lack of organization. There was, all over Lebanon, there were young men who ascended to high positions as the credential of being defenders of representatives, if you want, of their community or their neighborhood. They were empowered by this sense of legitimacy, which they would use to actually disobey direct orders from their leaders. So there was a real shift in hierarchies around this time, even from the party. As a result, and as the war dragged on, there was a need to increasingly professionalize and centralize the militias. And we saw this in the kind of militias that emerged in Amal, in the Lebanese forces, in the PSP. They killed off their opponents, like Bashir Jumail did with the Maladan and the Lemur, the Tigers militias, and they became qaids, became leaders of the Christian Shabab. He became the leader of the Christian Shabab, the young men who now completely dominated the militias. So what I'm saying is that one of the things that happened in the Civil War was that a new generation of young men were actually empowered by what happened. And we may not like the particular expression that took, but there was a certain sense of generational change and rebellion in that. But after 77, from 78 onwards, I would say, the war began to take on its own logic, perpetuated by the men who thrived on it, in all the different sectors of the country, but especially in Afghanistan, where Bashir Jumail ruled. Militias set up militia states, complete with sanitation, military infrastructure, training, education, and most of all, heavy taxation, which allowed them to become these mini-statelets of imported and exported goods, control of the state, of the port and the route and these things. One of the main results of the taxation policy seems to have been grotesque enrichment of their leaders and an emergence of mafia-like businessmen who actually, and this is documented in the work of Fawaz Lahulsi, actually worked together. They had holding companies. So they might have been engaged in fighting during the day, but in the evening they could meet and have a friendly chat about their common businesses. Leaders and members of the street gangs controlling West Beirut typically hailed from low-income groups. Although they often belonged to ideological parties and legitimized themselves according to that affiliation, a great deal of their legitimacy rested on sheer force. This is the Kabadayat I was talking about, the new leaders. The symbolic power, the honor and respect of the Suama had been founded on their ability to represent the street like the father would represent his children, at least in a conservative version, as a superior grown-up with a sense of morality and the power to support his children financially. Right? If we take that metaphor, the Kabadayat would be the teenagers, the rebel teenagers. They knew the streets. They had always had to win their honor through roughing and toughing on the street, and that kind of behavior suited the ethos of the war quite well, and it also shaped the ethos of the war that we had these leaders. So when the symbolic representation of the elites was undermined, they lost influence and they were challenged by these leaders. When the militias strengthened their organization, the Lebanese conflict became increasingly internationalized. This happened around the same time. The entry of the regional and international agendas only added to the entangled nature of the conflict and complicated the militia's original intentions, what they may have been. This gradual move from a rather representative conflict to with a high level of popular support to a more imposed conflict, I think we can see in all of Lebanon, but perhaps most clearly on the Christian side. But also on the Muslim and the leftist side. The militias became gradually more removed from the local population and indeed from each other. And this is the chaos of the late 80s, which some of you may remember. I think Birgitte does for sure. And Nadim. I don't. I went to Lebanon in the 90s for the first time, but I heard many stories about what the 80s were like, and the late 80s in particular conjure up this image of everyone, the Darwinian nightmare, kind of everyone against everyone. It lacked this orderliness, which East Beirut had because of the parasitic control. So we had this utter chaos which drove the inhabitants of West Beirut to demonstrate against the militias. And this brings me to another kind of mobilization, which is mobilization of civil society during the war. So I want to say a little bit about that. Before 75, Lebanon also had a fairly developed civil society scene. It actually has one of the longest civil society scenes. We didn't call it that, or they didn't call it that back then. Civil society and NGO are 1990s lingo. But many of these NGOs nevertheless existed, and they helped to resist the war. And they helped to resist the logic of hermetic separation between East and West. And I think to some extent this is a history that hasn't really been written. It's been written out a little bit of the war histories that we have. The fact that lawyers, doctors, and other professional groups organized demonstrations and sit-ins, and artists and intellectuals organized exhibitions and conferences that were happening through sport events. And this continued throughout the war. women groups, labor unions, war cripples, and relatives of kidnapped and disappeared persons all joined in the protest at some point. And I've been rereading Karam Karam's excellent work on civil society in Lebanon in the last couple of weeks. And he's making the point, or arguing, that if it hadn't been for the resilience of civil society, which was dominated by impoverished but steadfast middle classes, the economy and perhaps the whole raison d'etre of Lebanon would have collapsed. And this goes a little bit along with some of the arguments of Theodor Hahn in his post-war book. I wanted to show you this cartoon from 1988, which gives you a little bit of a sense of the atmosphere, perhaps, in the late 80s, of those riffraffs out there dominating the militias. Okay, so I was rereading the study of Karam Karam. Is it working? Okay. Oh, you can't see the pictures already? That's better.
Talk again.
On Karam Karam. Oh, can't see. And two things struck me when I was reading this study again. And the one thing is that on his history of the civil society during the war is that it was actually very resilient. It existed before the war, but it was, to some extent, it was empowered by the war, because it had a real raison d'etre. Whereas some of the civil society groups were very engaged in structural change, in changing the political formula, in changing the system, and so on before the war. Many of those people transferred into the militias of the Lebanese national movement. They became engaged in the revolutionary project, they picked up a gun. But those who didn't became very focused on humanitarian work. And I see a parallel here, perhaps, to what's going on in Syria now. I'll return to that in a second. The second thing is that the empowerment of civil society that paradoxically happened during the war became a platform for civil society after the war. This strikes a very hopeful tone, perhaps, that the experiences, the very rough experiences of working through the civil war environment gave a real push for civil society groups. And the 90s was very much a time of civil society. It's a shame Ziad is not with us today yet, because he was very engaged in that in the 90s. Joseph Bahoud is another one who is very central and who was also invited to this conference. There was a sense of optimism. There was a sense that the old agenda of transforming Lebanon's social and political system that the Lebanese national movement had pushed for with gun in hand could actually be carried out through these peaceful civil society work. And I think with this we return to Syria today and to Syria and Lebanon's integrated political cultures, which the title of my paper is about. Because I would venture that a certain transfer of experience is taking place from one to the other, a reciprocal transfusion or something like that. And the many lessons that Lebanese civil society have learned, I think Syrians now placed in Lebanon, because they've been forced to, they're listening to that and they're taking note of that. Some of the lessons that they have learned, I think, is that the change of the system is a very slow one, is a very long one, and one in which they've lost out in so many ways. Since 2005, there's been a very pessimistic mood in a lot of the civil society groups. They feel that there was a real change for revolution, for a different kind of revolution in 2005, a peaceful one, a change of the system. One of the groups, one of the big groups, is called Nahwa al-Muwataniya, towards citizenship. And I think the lesson today is that this march towards citizenship is a very, very long one, and the obstacles are huge. But there's a certain sort of pessimism. And I think the Syrians are listening to some of that pessimism. And part of that is that the system is more resilient. The system being the sectarian system, whatever you want to however you want to define that. So I see, when I go to Beirut, I see a lot of the first wave demonstrators, the first people who were involved in the first 3 or 4 months of peaceful protest in Damascus. I see them, and I see how they continue their struggle from Lebanon, and many of them as relief work. So I see that transformation from political work into relief work, or both things at the same time happening. Activism is redefined by this context of humanitarian catastrophe, the fragmentation of the political field. And it seems to me that a sort of merging is taking place, so it's not a one-directional thing. The Lebanese activists are also being very influenced and inspired by what's going on in Syria. Part of the logic, I mean, people have joined different conclusions. Some would be drawing the conclusion that it's pretty hopeless and pretty bleak what's been happening in Syria, and revolution in Lebanon. In that way, it's not a way to go. But I think it's also changing the mood for others in a different direction, which is that revolution is possible. And revolution is not a nationally based thing, but something that should be carried out transnationally. So I see a lot of activists in Lebanon, Lebanese, tied in with the Syrian uprisings through particular groups, such as the revolutionary socialists in Syria. And this is, in a way, back to the old agendas of the Lebanese national movement. I mean, the hope is to change the social and political system in Lebanon. And they see that as part of a larger revolutionary agenda. Across the region and perhaps in the whole world as well, as it is. So for the Syrian activists, and I think Ali will tell you a lot more about that, Lebanon offers perhaps a sanctuary, or maybe not a sanctuary, but a platform of sorts. A place where they can be inspired by the long history of organization in civil society and learn certain things. But of course it's a very precarious sanctuary, because they're also met with scorn and racism and even exploitation from some Lebanese, social exclusion. But for some it is a platform, a launch pad for continued revolution. There's a lot of activity across the border, which is not just about bringing weapons, which, like Jakob said, is what we hear about in the media. But there's a lot of transfer of peaceful revolution as well. And inevitably, reform and change in Lebanon and Syria is thought of as two parts of the same project. This goes for both sides of the camp. Like Samir Qasir said, when the Arab Spring starts in Beirut, it will herald the blooming of roses in Damascus. This is something he said just before he was killed in 2005. And I guess it's a little hard to fully believe in that today, I think, the way things are. But I guess you could even reverse the slogan today, that if the Arab Spring starts in Damascus, it will herald the blooming of roses in Beirut. It's not what it looks like, I know. But this is what some people believe and some people are inspired by. So I think there's a merging of agendas going on today. So this is what I wanted to say, really. I could say, and one could say a lot more about mobilization in the military sense in Syria. And I think that's a story of its own. And I will leave that partly to Ziad to talk more about it. Also the mobilization, of course, of civil society. And I think we should say a couple of words about that. This is a very pessimistic, yet optimistic quote from Kamal al-Lawan in 2005. Of course, part of the inspiration for the uprising in Syria came from the group of civil society activists that we associate with the so-called Damascus Spring. He said there's no politically mobilized street today, but when there will be, this will completely change the nature of the game. So it's kind of prophetic. There will be a moment. And I think all these things have been so baffling. The most baffling has been the growth of institutions out of what seems like nothing. People were so pessimistic before 2011 because there was no civil society in Syria. Well, it has emerged out of seemingly nothing. And I think this gives us a lot of hope and inspiration. Not just the big political institutions of around the SNC, but primarily and importantly the local coordination committees and a number of new political parties and groups that have appeared. Life has been politicized again, even though we may not see it so much today because of all the violence. That is also what's been going on. People have had to learn how to organize. We have a saying in Danish, maybe it's also in English, Trouble teaches a naked woman how to spin. to
I think it's lost in English translation.
It sounds pretty good how to naked woman. If you're in trouble, you will learn how to sew and dress yourself. That's pretty much what's going on. That was really not a good ad hoc translation. It wasn't part of my paper. So of course this war is very different today than the Lebanese war, but I think some of the way in which people were mobilized and were then later on alienated by the very war that they were sucked into. Perhaps some of the same things are going on today. That is certainly worth discussing. I think the big difference is, of course, the nature of the states and the nature of the system in Lebanon being something you can't really compare. But what was really what people rebelled against, that was the revolution that was taking place. So a revolution was taking place, and lessons from it have been sort of slowly transferred, perhaps, into the political culture of Syria. And this is not just something that's happened after 2011. Lebanon and Syria are very integrated political cultures, even though they look like very different political systems. So I'll leave you with a picture of 4 kidnapped people of the Syria Documentation Center, who are part of the new civil society that's also grown out of